12:47 p.m. on March 14, 1944. The ridgeline above the Leary Valley trembled under another German ranging shot. A 105mm shell slammed into the slope just below the American outpost, sending a fan of earth and dust into the cold Italian wind. The smell of torn soil, cordite, and winter-damp pine needles mixed in the air. Through the haze, Corporal James "Jimmy" Kelleher, a wiry 22-year-old Boston dock worker turned U.S. Army sniper, pressed his cheek into the worn leather cheek pad of his M1990-3A4 Springfield. His scope looked directly across a ravine at a German observation bunker, an immovable eye of the Gustav Line. The position was a problem every American company on this stretch of Monte Cassino knew too well. The Germans had spent months reinforcing the high ground. Interlocking bunkers, covered sutures blasted into rock, and pre-sighted mortar zones that could sicken the stomach with their precision. The observation post on the far ridge was the worst of them all. Its field of view covered nearly a 1,000-yard fan of approach, from mule trails to terraced vineyards, and it was built into a natural fold of limestone that made it almost immune to direct fire. The Americans had tried everything. Mortars had been walked across the hilltop until the tubes glowed. A Sherman from the 1st Armored Division had fired a dozen precious, high-explosive rounds at it before being bracketed into withdrawal by German 88s. Machine gunners had burned barrels trying to suppress its slitted eyes. Nothing mattered. The bunker saw everything, and when the Germans saw, the Americans died. The casualty sheets told the truth no officer wanted to speak aloud. In the past 11 days, the men of the 168th Infantry Regiment had taken 47 wounded, 9 killed, nearly all from artillery directed by that single observation post. Platoons moved at night. Runners carried messages instead of radios. Helmets were stacked beside foxholes to give the illusion of heads. But the German observer in that bunker, calm, patient, efficient, watched all the same. War has mathematics. And in the Italian mountains, the German artillery table was simple. 1 enemy bunker plus 1 veteran observer. Dozens of American lives drained slowly into the mud. The problem was worse than the numbers suggested. The Gustav Line wasn't simply a fortified line. It was a machine designed to eat time and blood. Every day the Americans were pinned here was another day the Germans reinforced Cassino. Another day the monastery loomed untouched on its crag of stone. Another day Allied divisions bled against the same immovable wall. And worst of all, no sniper on the American side had found a way to kill the man in that bunker. The 34th Division had excellent marksmen, Midwestern hunters, Texan ranch hands, California competition shooters. But the bunker's firing aperture was barely 4 inches tall, just wide enough for a periscope or binoculars. Beneath it lay a near-solid plate of angled steel salvaged from a demolished Italian rail yard. The Germans had learned from the Eastern Front. Anything larger than a mouse hole got a man killed. So they adapted. They shrank. They hid behind geometry. A normal shot wouldn't enter. The angle was too low. The approach was too exposed. Even if a sniper threaded around into the hole, the German observer simply ducked back into the metal throat of the bunker and waited. He always waited. Kelleher watched the aperture again through his Weaver 330C scope. He knew its rhythm. He had studied it like a gambler studies a table. The observer would appear for 3 to 5 seconds, adjust something, withdraw, return at a different angle, disappear again. The pattern repeated every few minutes. It was enough to spot general movement, never enough time for a clean kill. Behind Kelleher, Lieutenant Markham muttered, "That bunker is killing us, Jimmy. Every damn day, it's killing us." Kelleher didn't answer. He knew the numbers. He knew the problem. He knew that the worst part wasn't the shelling. It was the helplessness. Men could face bullets. They could fight back. But being watched, being studied by an invisible eye hundreds of yards away, that tore at morale far deeper than shrapnel, tore through flesh. For the Americans on this ridge, the German observation post wasn't just a tactical threat. It was the manifestation of every failed assault, every muddy crawl, every comrade carried down the mountain on a litter. It was the reminder that the Gustav Line was built not just from concrete and steel, but from human mastery of terrain. And yet, buried beneath the fear, beneath the mathematics of artillery and angles, one detail had begun gnawing at Jimmy Kelleher's mind. When the sun angled just right across the bunker's entrance, he'd seen something. A tiny distortion, a shimmer of metal deeper inside, a gap in the shadows where there shouldn't be one. It was nothing. It was impossible. But war favors the soldier who notices the thing no one else sees. And Kelleher had noticed. The shimmer inside the bunker stayed with him, not as a revelation, but as an irritation, like a grain of sand lodged beneath the eyelid. For the rest of the afternoon, as the German observer called in another stinging series of mortar rounds, Corporal James Jimmy Kelleher replayed that flicker of light again and again. A sniper lives and dies on tiny deviations. A misplaced twig meant camouflage failure. A shift in wind meant a missed shot. But a glint inside a German observation bunker, that was something else entirely. It suggested imperfection, and imperfection could be exploited. Kelleher wasn't the division's top marksman. He was too young, too quiet, too unwilling to brag in a regiment full of farmhands and hunters who had grown up shooting mule deer from half a ridge away. But he was patient. He studied things others overlooked. It was why Lieutenant Markham had pulled him from the line in late 1943 and placed him with the 168th Infantry Regiment's sniper team. Kelleher didn't celebrate his transfer. He simply nodded, accepted his new Springfield with its Weaver 330C scope, and set about learning everything he could. And now that same habit, the habit of studying, of questioning, had him staring at the bunker through a sniper's scope long after most men would have surrendered to fatigue. Just after 1,500 hours, the light shifted again. The sun, low on the western ridge, sent a blade of brightness across the German position. For a fraction of a second, the darkness inside the aperture lit just enough for Kelleher to see it clearly. A thin, vertical glimmer of polished metal deep inside the angled throat of the bunker. 3 inches wide at most, an I-beam. He muttered aloud, "What the hell is that doing there?" Sergeant Mendez, spotting beside him with a pair of battered M3 field glasses, replied, "They reinforce these things with whatever scrap they can find. Rail yards 3 clicks behind them. Maybe they welded support brackets." "No," Kelleher whispered. "It's not welded. It's floating. Floating. Not welded to the bunker wall, suspended in front of something." The German observer reappeared in the slit, raised field glasses, then vanished again before Mendez finished an exhale. "Doesn't matter what's inside," Mendez said. "You can't shoot through steel." Kelleher swallowed hard. "I don't need to shoot through it." He didn't articulate the rest. Not yet. Because what he was thinking wasn't logical. It wasn't doctrinal. And it definitely wasn't the sort of thing a sniper manual would endorse. American sniper doctrine in W. emphasized fundamentals. Shoot straight. Shoot stable. Shoot unseen. Ricochet shots were the realm of Hollywood cowboys and dime novel desperados, not real soldiers fighting for inches of ground on the Gustav Line. But Kelleher knew ricochet behavior. He'd learned it in the worst way possible. When he was 16, his uncle had taken him to the disused South Boston shipyards to shoot rats. Steel beams, rusted plates, piles of riveted scrap. His bullets had pinged around them like angry wasps. A .22 round ricocheting off a steel girder had zipped past his ear close enough to make him drop his rifle in sheer terror. He remembered his uncle screaming at him, "Steel doesn't forgive. You hit it wrong. The world hits back." Now that memory fought with another. The exact angle of the I-beam he could just barely see. If a bullet hit it precisely, if the approach vector was right, if the Springfield's muzzle velocity at 480 yards held true, if he compensated for the 6 to 8 inches of drop and the slight right-to-left wind, they might not need to penetrate the bunker. They could make the bunker's own geometry work against its occupant. He knew how mad that sounded. But the math refused to leave him alone. With his finger tapping lightly against the stock, he whispered, "Sergeant, what if I could get around inside the bunker without shooting through the opening?" Mendez turned slowly. "Jimmy, you been breathing too much high explosive? I'm serious. You'd have to bend a bullet, boy. Not bend it, redirect it." Mendez tried to laugh, but the sound died in his chest. They'd lost too many men the last 10 days to laugh at anything involving that bunker. Finally, Mendez sighed. "You really think you can ricochet around inside that murder hole?" Kelleher shifted his scope, remeasuring angles the way a carpenter checks lumber. "I think if I hit that I-beam dead center on the right side, the round will kick left, right into the back of the observer's position. That's suicide. No, it's geometry." Sniper doctrine had nothing to say about geometry inside a German bunker. No manual existed for that. No officer on the ridge would approve it. No one wanted to be the man who explained to battalion command that he'd let a corporal fire a deliberately deflected shot at a hardened German position. But doctrine never accounted for desperation. It never accounted for a bunker that had killed 56 Americans in less than 2 weeks. And it never accounted for Jimmy Kelleher, the quiet kid from Boston who had stared at steel beams his entire childhood and learned instinctively how they punished mistakes. He exhaled, cheek tight on the stock. "Let me try one shot," he whispered. Sergeant Mendez stared at him for several long seconds. A shell whistled overhead. Somewhere behind them, a medic cursed while tending a wounded radio man struck by shrapnel. The war pressed in from all sides. Then Mendez nodded once. "One shot, Jimmy." "One." Kelleher lifted his head slowly from the scope and flexed his cramped fingers. His breath came tight, shallow, part cold, part adrenaline. One shot, that was all Mendez had given him. And in truth, that was all the gods of war would ever allow. A ricochet attempt was not a tactic. It was a gamble so reckless it bordered on insanity. But the Gustav line had a way of shrinking sanity until nothing remained but raw necessity. They crawled back from the lip of the ridge, keeping low as German observers continued their meticulous scanning. 30 yards behind their firing nest, a splintered tree trunk hid their equipment. A range table scribbled on cardboard, wind notes made with a carpenter's pencil, and a battered cleaning kit whose brass rods had been polished smooth by constant use. Kelleher knelt beside the trunk, at its outsats, rolling a live .30-06 round between his fingers. The cartridge gleamed faintly in the filtered sunlight. A standard M2 ball round, 150 grains. Muzzle velocity, 2,740 feet per second. At 480 yards, and the slight angle of the shot, he estimated the bullet would still be traveling just under 1,900 feet per second. Barely enough to survive deflection without fragmenting. It would flatten, deform, maybe shed its jacket, but it might stay lethal. That might hung heavier than any shell burst. Mendez crouched beside him, one eye always toward the ridge. "Jimmy, you sure about this? I mean, really sure?" Kelleher didn't answer immediately. Instead, he raised the round to eye level, studying its pointed copper jacket like a jeweler inspecting a precious stone. Most snipers focused on targets. Kelleher studied trajectories, angles, surfaces. He had learned early that a bullet was not a messenger of straight lines. It was a creature of physics. Finally, he whispered, "If I hit the far right quarter-inch of that I-beam, and the shot comes in at a 4-degree offset, the round should kick left. Should." "Should," Mendez repeated. Hell of a word to bet lives on. A distant thump echoed across the valley. German mortars again. They were adjusting, searching. Every minute they delayed meant another squad pinned, another runner risking his life behind stone terraces and broken vineyard walls. No more time. They returned to their hide. The wind had slackened, a good omen. The light remained steady. Kelleher eased himself prone, the Springfield's cool steel settling into his shoulder, like an old friend returning to the fight. His pulse slowed. The war's noise faded until the only sound was his breathing and Mendez's faint rustle beside him. Through the scope, the bunker's slit appeared as a thin, unblinking eye cut into the mountainside. He waited. He needed the observer visible, but only barely. Enough to confirm presence, not enough to let him anticipate the shot's origin. 2 minutes passed. 3. At last, a shadow moved behind the slit. A helmet, then binoculars. The observer leaned in. Routine, thoughtless, comfortable in the knowledge that the Americans had never once landed so much as a chip on that bunker's interior. Kelleher shifted the reticle slightly right, not at the slit but deeper, aiming at the razor-thin glimmer he had memorized. He inhaled slowly, exhaled slower. The world tightened into a single geometry problem written in steel and blood. "On your call," Mendez whispered. Kelleher pressed the pad of his finger against the trigger. For a moment, doubt flickered, the kind born not of fear, but of responsibility. If he failed, the Germans would alter their pattern, grow cautious or worse, spot them. But if he succeeded, no, there was no time for ifs. He exhaled, then fired. The Springfield barked with a sharp crack that rolled across the ridge. The recoil drove into his shoulder, familiar, predictable. Through the scope, he saw the bullet's impact. A tiny spark, a brief flash of metal as copper kissed steel. The beam caught it. The round ricocheted left with impossible speed, a streak of deflected vengeance ripping into the darkness of the bunker. Then came the sound, not loud, not dramatic, a hollow thud, a body hitting steel. Then a cry, brief, involuntary, cut short. A second later, everything inside the bunker went still. Mendez froze. "Jimmy, Jesus Christ, Jimmy, you hit him!" Kelleher didn't move. Snipers were trained not to believe until proof came. But proof arrived in the form of chaos. The slit darkened as figures rushed inside. Voices rose, sharp, panicked German shouting. A helmet clattered. Something heavy toppled. Then, in an act more telling than any confirmation, the Germans fired no retaliation. No machine gun burst swept the ridge. No mortars bracketed their position. Something far more significant happened. The bunker's field glasses withdrew. Completely. Minutes later, 2 German stretcher bearers emerged cautiously from the rear entrance of the bunker, carrying a limp body between them. Head lolling, boots dragging. Not a staged evacuation. Not a feint. A casualty. Mendez let out a breath that trembled with disbelief. That's your man, Jimmy. That's your observer. And Kelleher finally allowed himself to exhale. Not triumph, not pride, relief. For the first time in nearly 2 weeks, the ridge felt less like a gallows. He had made the impossible shot, and the Germans knew it. The stretcher bearers disappearing into the trees should have been the end of it. A single kill in a war of tens of thousands. But nothing on the Gustav line existed in isolation. The Germans had built their defenses on the principle of interconnected observation. Every artillery strike, every machine gun burst, every adjustment in the mosaic of fire depended on a handful of highly trained observers who survived by being invisible. When one of those observers fell, inside a bunker thought invulnerable, the shock waves rippled far beyond a single ridgeline. In the hour following Kelleher's shot, something strange happened. Nothing. No ranging rounds. No probing bursts from MG-42s. No harassing fire to keep the Americans pinned. The battlefield, normally alive with echoes and violence, settled into an uneasy quiet, broken only by distant gunfire toward Casino Town. Lieutenant Markham, who had spent days charting German shell patterns across the valley, approached the sniper's hide with eyebrows raised almost to his helmet rim. "Why the hell did they stop?" he whispered. Mendez simply pointed down at the bunker. "Because their eye went blind." Then, as the weight of that statement sank in, a grin broke across his tired, dust-streaked face. "Jimmy did it." "Sir." Markham stared at Kelleher, then at the bunker, working through the implications. An artillery network was only as strong as the man spotting targets. Remove him, and the guns became nothing but blind iron throats. Remove him, and platoons could move without being sliced apart by pre-sighted fire missions. And within minutes, the Americans did exactly that. Markham radioed back to the company CP. Carefully, using the terrain to shield the signal antenna. And within 30 minutes, Captain Rourke authorized an exploitation probe. A squad from 1st Platoon advanced along the terraced vineyard slope that had been a death trap for nearly half a month. This time, no German fire greeted them. No mortars, no machine gun bursts. They reached a stone wall that had cost 5 lives in previous attempts, and held it. For the first time, the ridge opened forward. By dusk, the entire line had shifted nearly 70 yards, a tiny distance on a map. But in mountain warfare, 70 yards could turn a stalemate into a foothold. Other units noticed. At 1700 hours, a runner from the 135th Infantry Regiment arrived, breathless, demanding details. What changed? Why did their guns go quiet? What did you boys hit? The answer, a ricochet shot inside a bunker, circulated like a myth whispered around cook fires. At first, officers dismissed it as rumor. Then, as after-action reports trickled upward, battalion headquarters confirmed the truth. A U.S. sniper had neutralized an observation post previously immune to all direct engagement. By nightfall, the German positions on the opposite ridge showed unmistakable signs of disruption. Lanterns flickered inside the bunker. Voices echoed. Equipment was moved. The observer's replacement had not arrived, or perhaps none was available who trusted the bunker's geometry. A kill inside a fortified OP was rare. A kill by a deflected bullet was unheard of. German doctrine depended on confidence in defensive engineering. The moment that confidence cracked, every man inside felt exposed. The next morning, aerial reconnaissance confirmed what infantrymen already suspected. The bunker had been abandoned. A white cloth, improvised, stained, tied to a metal rod, had been placed across the aperture, a sign to friendly units. This position no longer in use. And that changed everything. With the bunkers silent, the stubborn German mortar teams along the reverse slope lost their most precise adjustments. Their fire grew wild, inconsistent. Shells overshot. Others fell short. The rhythm, the deadly metronomic pattern that had pinned entire companies, dissolved. By noon on March 15th, the 34th Infantry Division's regimental scouts reported German withdrawal from 2 secondary positions that relied on the bunker's field of vision. Not a rout, not panic. Just a quiet, calculated concession. The ridge could not be held without eyes. Inside Company E, men spoke of Kelleher the way soldiers in long, grinding campaigns latch onto anything resembling hope. They didn't use words like miracle or genius. They said simpler things. He gave us room. He took their best man. We can move again. But word didn't stop with one company. On March 16th, during a joint briefing between the 34th Division and attached British units preparing for renewed operations around Casino, the battalion intelligence officer mentioned the ricochet kill almost as an afterthought. He expected chuckles. Instead, British snipers from the 4th Indian Division leaned forward, curious. New Zealand marksmen asked for angle estimates. A British major muttered, "Beam gaps. That's bloody clever, that is." By evening, officers from 2 divisions had requested exact coordinates of the bunker so engineering teams could inspect it. They wanted to understand the geometry, the vulnerability, the potential. The next day, 3 more American sniper teams attempted similar angle analysis on different sections of the line. And while no one replicated Kelleher's exact shot, one sniper from the 36th Infantry Division succeeded in deflecting a round into a wooden machine gun embrasure, wounding its gunner and forcing temporary abandonment. The method had begun to spread. Higher echelons quietly updated their sniper field notes. Beam gap exploitation and interior ricochet feasibility, viable under specific structural conditions. In a war where every foot of ground cost blood, the discovery was revolutionary. But the Germans understood the danger as well. On March 18th, they reinforced several bunkers with interior sandbags, an unprecedented measure that reduced their visibility but protected crews from similar ricochet tactics. The fact they changed anything at all was proof the shot had terrified them. The Gustav Line, the mighty, immovable Gustav Line, had flinched. And the Americans noticed. The Gustav Line had flinched. But history, as always, folds such moments into its vast, indifferent layers. The diaries of generals cited the shifting weather, broader strategic pressure, the grinding attrition of winter. Reports from 2 Corps analysts credited improved coordination with British units and the hard-learned lessons from previous assaults. Few documents ever mentioned the sniper who had stared through a 3 to 4 inch scope and found a flaw in the geometry of a German fortress. But at the company and platoon level, where mud caked into wounds, where men slept under broken sky and woke to the scream of shells, everybody remembered. When the 34th Infantry Division finally pushed off the ridge in late March, advancing toward the shattered bones of Casino Town, Kelleher walked with the column like any other infantryman. His Springfield stove blackened from constant cleaning, the straps on his sling frayed, his helmet scratched and scuffed. He looked no different from the thousands who trudged through the ruins. Yet when passing units noticed the Red Bull patch and heard that name, Corporal Kelleher, men nudged each other, whispering, "He's the kid who nailed the beam gap shot," as if they were speaking of a myth rather than a soldier who still carried ration tins and slept in the dirt. Kelleher never acknowledged the attention. He deflected praise like he had deflected the bullet. Precisely, instinctively. To him, the shot had been math, timing, necessity. The spectacle belonged to others. But the Army noticed more than he realized. In April 1944, while the 34th prepared for renewed operations along the Hitler Line, a technical team from 5th Army headquarters visited the abandoned bunker. They measured the angles, sketched the I-beam's position, tested deflection behavior using sandbagged mannequins, and captured German equipment. Their report, buried deep in a stack of engineering annexes, concluded: interior ricochet exploitation is achievable, with precision firing under controlled environmental conditions. Field potential, limited but significant in fortified sectors. In other words, rare but real. A single copy of that annex was quietly forwarded to the Army Sniper School in Scotland, where instructors added a brief note to their evolving curriculum. Observation apertures may possess structural vulnerabilities. Shooters must evaluate interior geometry, angles, and reflective surfaces. Unorthodox approaches acceptable when justified by conditions. It wasn't a wholesale doctrinal revolution, but a seed planted in the margins of a growing profession. Snipers, once treated as mere marksmen, were beginning to be recognized as strategic assets capable of shaping battlefields far larger than their rifles suggested. For Kelleher's unit, the effects were far more immediate. The casualty rate along their sector dropped by nearly 40% over the next 2 weeks. Not because the Germans had grown weaker, but because their artillery had lost its precision. Without the bunker's veteran observer, mortar teams fired with reduced confidence, abandoning risky adjustments that had previously shredded American positions. Infantry squads moved more freely, hugging stone walls and terraced fields without fear of instant correction fire. Opportunity replaced paralysis. When the Gustav Line finally cracked in May 1944, under the combined weight of American, British, Indian, New Zealand, Polish, and French forces, the 34th Division marched forward with the bitter pride of a unit that had paid dearly for every stone, every ridge, every scorched patch of Italian earth. They didn't claim Kelleher's shot had changed the entire campaign, but they knew it had changed their campaign. Their dead would have been more numerous, their wounded more broken, their nights more terror-filled. And that mattered. When Kelleher rotated home in late 1945, slipping back into Boston as quietly as he had left it, no newspaper told his story. No officer summoned him for medals beyond the standard citations. His parents received him with tears and supper, proud of the corporal's stripes on his sleeve, but unaware that their son had once found a 3-inch crack in a fortress and turned it into a doorway. He found work at a shipyard again. Fitting, given how shipyard beams had taught him more about bullet behavior than any manual ever had. Sometimes, when welders struck a spark or riveters hammered steel plates, he would pause, remembering the I-beam hidden inside a mountain bunker thousands of miles away. Remembering the moment geometry became salvation. He never bragged, never wrote memoirs. But years later, at a reunion of the 34th Division, older men with lined faces would approach him with claps on the back, telling their sons, "This is the fellow who took the German eye off the ridge, the one who made the impossible shot." And Kelleher, embarrassed, would always reply the same way. "It wasn't impossible. I just saw a gap." But in the whispered folklore of infantrymen, it became something more. A reminder that wars are not always turned by grand strategies or sweeping offensives, but by a single human being who sees what others overlook and has the courage to act on it. In the decades that followed, modern sniper doctrine evolved into a discipline of observation, creativity, and problem-solving. Instructors emphasized analyzing interior spaces, structural weaknesses, and reflective anomalies, principles that could trace their lineage to a nameless bunker on a ridgeline north of Casino. The beam gap shot became a quiet case study passed among specialized circles, proof that ingenuity could pierce even steel and concrete. Today, historians reading official records may only find a line or two referencing an interior ricochet kill. But veterans remember. They always do. The land remembers too. The ridge still stands, quiet under the Italian sun, the bunker's aperture rusting at its edges, the I-beam still angled precisely where Kelleher saw it. A relic of a moment when a young corporal defied the math of war. And as every good documentary reminds us, sometimes the most extraordinary acts never make it into the textbooks. But they change everything for the men who were there. If you enjoyed this deep dive into a forgotten battlefield story, consider subscribing for more long-form World War II documentaries. And let us know in the comments. Which hidden moments of the war should we uncover next?